All right, and we're getting started. So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining me today. We are going to be talking about standardized testing and, hey Courtney, and briefly talking about educational barriers. So by educational barriers, we're mainly focusing on the barriers that are in the way for people to get into higher education, and even just better education systems in general. We're not going to go in depth as much on those as I would like because the standardized testing portion is going to take the most time. But remember that you all are more than welcome to ask any questions that you have this entire time. And if you have a question on a totally different topic, I don't mind. Also, quick reminder is in 2 weeks, we'll be hosting another one. And I'll be having a special seminar before Election Day, probably early October, on everything election based. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you send me a message or an email. You can go on my website, all my contact info is on there. You can text me, you can send me a message while we're on here, because that's going to be very specific to what we're going to see on ballots across the country. So very important, very specific, but definitely something that is a really necessary part of what we'll be doing here. So brief overview, we're going to be talking about what is standardized testing, what is, that standard test, what does it mean, who created these tests, how they affect people, and then the barriers that we kind of see in other forms of education. So just very small overview. For those of you on Instagram who can't see it, again, you can always head over to Facebook or to the Zoom to check in. So what is standardized testing? Well, standardized testing, by the definition, is any form of a test that requires all test takers to answer the same questions or a selection of questions from common bank of questions in the same way, that is, in a scored, standard, or consistent manner, which makes it possible to compare the relative performance of individual students or groups of students. Now, while we think of certain things in standard form, so we think of all sorts of tests that way, the term is primarily associated with large-scale tests that are administered to large populations of students. So we're mainly talking about high schoolers, middle schoolers, hey Injury, people in elementary school, people in college, people trying to get into graduate programs, all these things that very directly work alongside this definition of standardized testing. Examples of standardized tests are multiple choice exams, partial writing exams, and we'll talk more specifically about exam terms like the SAT in just a second. So first off, we have the SAT as a type of standardized test. The SAT was created by College Board in 1926. The name has changed multiple times. The way they've scored has changed multiple times. It's kind of evolved over the last almost 100 years or so. 1926 is a very, very, very long time ago, especially whenever most tests were not around during this era. So this is really one of the first large-scale modern tests that we're going to see that was standardized. The test that came before this that kind of led to this by the creator was one of the military tests. And you can also think of the IQ test kind of as a prerequisite for this test as well. But this is really one of the first major large-scale tests that we see. The PSAT came in 1971. The PSAT and the SAT work together. The PSAT is like a prerequisite SAT, very literally. And so it helps some students, or is supposed to help some students basically get the opportunity to get scholarships and other things before they take the SAT, as well as prepare them for the SAT. And then the ACT was started in 1959. That stands for American College Testing. And it's, again, very similar to the SAT, but it covers different areas in a different way. So where the SAT can be, very general, math, writing, other things, or you can take very specified tests that you want to take. So you can take, you can take all sorts of tests in relation to this. It's kind of close to the AP testing format. The ACT covers more science reasoning, and you don't see that on the SAT. So more advanced science related works better for some students, worse for others. And the scoring systems are very different. So the ACT is scored, I think it's up to 34 or so, if not 32, whereas the SAT is up to 1600. The GRE is the Graduate Record Examination, and it's for graduate schools in the US and Canada. It's owned and administered by the Educational Testing Service, who we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. And it was established in, it's considered to be established in 1949 or 1936. It's kind of some debate about that, so we're going to stick with the 1949 date. The GMAT is the Graduate Management Admissions Test, and it's a computer adaptive test that's intended to assess certain analytical, writing, quantitative, verbal, and reading skills in written English for graduate management programs like an MBA. Now, we also have, there we go. We also have the LSAT, which was in 1945 as its origin date. The LSAT is the Law School Administration Test. It's a half-day standardized test for prospective law school candidates to take. And it's similar in some sense to the MCAT that, again, they're specified tests for graduate entry. So these are tests after you've already completed your undergraduate degree that you then take to try and get into a higher education area. The MCAT was started in 1928, and it stands for the Medical College Admission Test. It's a computer-based standard test for prospective medical students, and it's taken in the US, Australia, Canada, and the Caribbean islands. So it's supposed to assess problem solving, critical thinking, and written analysis of knowledge of specific concepts and principles. So very specified again. And then you have generalized state standardized testing. This is testing that is done K through 12. So whenever we're kind of thinking about these tests, again, a lot of these tests that we're talking about are either entry for some level or another, but there are standardized tests that prevent you or can allow you to go on through your, elementary school, through middle school, through high school that you have to pass and move on. These tests vary from state to state. For Texas, we took the STAR test, as many of you are familiar with, as well as a couple of other versions of tests. If you're from literally any other state, you can be taking an entirely different name test. And these tests are, again, used to kind of gauge the education system, and they are also supposed to be prerequisites more often than not for moving on. So, the origins of standardized testing. First, it's not necessarily a test specifically, but the concept of standardized testing really came from a multiple choice test that was created in 1914 by Frederick J. Kelly. He was trying to figure out a way that was easy to kind of gauge where students are and kind of their ability to move forward or not. And so he created the multiple choice test. That format wasn't seen before this. So it was a fairly new format. And it helped create the framework for all standardized tests following. The multiple choice test gave way because it was a completely new idea of testing students, period. And it allowed for modern day standardized testing to take place. Now, according to his own words, Frederick J. Kelly said himself that these tests are too crude to be used and should be abandoned years after creating the original multiple choice test. And the reason why I think this is so important is whenever you have a creator's framework in mind, it shapes the way that the test takes form, or just with anything. So if you have, for example, a creator who believes that certain groups are more important than others, or for example, say that believes that dogs are very, very important, then that could influence the way that they then create whatever it is they're creating, whether it's an organization, whether it's, something else entirely. Your beliefs and your individual perspective affects everything that you do, especially when it's coming directly from you and it's the first time it's being seen. So because we've never seen this before, and it's coming from him, it's very important to understand and note that years later, he then regretted this entire situation being started. So we're kind of gonna jump around a little bit. I had another way I wanted to go through the presentation, but I didn't really think that it fit as well. So I think it's gonna be more important that we talk about the problems with the SAT before we talk about who created the SAT, so that we can kind of understand how the creation mattered. I think a lot of times when we have these conversations, people want to say that it doesn't really matter, that, you know, so-and-so believes this or that. But again, framework is so essential to understanding how something became what it is. Because when you create something, again, with a certain mindset in place, it can affect what happens. So again, just to understand. So the SAT is supposed to be this neutral framework test. We're supposed to have a test that allows essentially for everybody to get ahead. And, you know, this is the idea, the modern idea, is that they're supposed to be unbiased. They're supposed to, you know, gauge people based off of their ability in comparison to everyone else. And they're supposed to be fair. The idea is that the more you study, the further ahead you can get, and that, you know, if you do well on these tests, you should be rewarded. If you don't do well, then you don't necessarily deserve that same access. Now, Teen Vogue, which I know seems kind of an odd place to cite from, has become a really phenomenal resource on all things standardized racism in the last few years. Their journalism, hey Tiva, their journalism has really become excellent, which is why I'm using them. But as always, everything I use here is cited. So at the end of the presentation, you're more than welcome to go back and look at the link and explore the article more. So Mariana Vera did this whole assessment recently on standardized testing, and she said, ideally, standardized tests are supposed to be neutral, value-free assessments of how hard students work. The more students study, the more seriously they take their education, and the better they will perform on these tests. In high-stakes test settings, standardized tests are used as primary determinants of student access to, or else denial of resources, opportunities, and spaces. Furthermore, ostensibly, the students who work hardest will earn higher scores, and those scores will be given them an upper hand in the college admissions process. This particular narrative neatly aligns with the illusion of America's meritocratic tradition. Those who work the hardest will reap the greatest benefits, never mind structural inequality. But studies have proven time and time again that standardized tests are much better at revealing things like household income, race, and level of parental education than they are at predicting the success of students in college classrooms. So again, keep this in mind. These tests have been proven. There are so many studies. You can Google, you know, SAT doesn't prove academic worthiness or is not a good predictor of, you know, where people will go. Yet they're still used. And yet people consistently argue that it's a great system when it's really not. Furthermore, oops, why did it pause my screen sharing? Hold on one second, you all. Apparently, they paused my screen sharing. Okay. So this is a section from the article, but this is taken from multiple cited places that did in-depth research on the SATs. And it says, compare the two 1998 SAT verbal section completion items with similar themes. This item, the item correctly answered by more Blacks than whites, was discarded by the Educational Testing Service, whereas the item that has a higher disparate impact on Black students became part of the actual SAT. On one of the items, which was of medium difficulty, 62% of whites and 38% of Black students answered correctly, resulting in a large impact of 24%. On the second item, 8% more Black people answered than white people correctly. And so very literally from the SAT, the Educational Testing Service will pick answers that don't test well among certain groups and use them anyways. So they have the information that these answers are very clearly disparate and are very clearly not equally assessing other folks, yet they use them anyways. So keep this in mind again about the ETS. Again, another little section. This is taken from a book called The Cost of Good Intentions, Why the Supreme Court's Decision Upholding Affirmative Action Admission Programs is Detrimental to the Cause. And it's 2006. I'll include a link as well as this in the end, and you can read it for free, I believe. But it talks about, again, some of these answers. So one of the questions that was asked on the 1980s exam was, So it says a runner to a marathon is, and then the answers A through D say envoy to embassy, martyr to massacre, horseman to regatta, horse to stable. Now, approximately 53% of white students chose C, which was the correct answer, but only 22% of Black students chose C. Critics of the test hypothesized that test takers from lower income households failed to properly answer the question because the word regatta was not in their vernacular. Now, I don't necessarily love the phrasing of this. It is, it is really important to kind of address the fact that 50% of one group answered one answer, which was the correct answer, while only 22% of another group got the correct answer. For some of you who are watching, you might not even know what an envoy is. You might not know what a regatta is, or an horseman. And so these terms tend to be related to class, and classism and racism often play hand in hand. They can be kind of part of one another. They are not the same at all, but classism and racism do interact a lot of times when we're talking about systematic racism and the effects of systematic racism. And so whenever you see something like this, but the question is still not removed from a test, again, the fact that there is a clear bias and a clear inability from certain groups to do the exact same percentage-wise as another group, then the test and the questions have to be biased. This, again, is from the Supreme Court's decision. And so in, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but early 2000s, the Supreme Court decided to uphold affirmative action admission programs. Affirmative action is a whole other thing we can talk about. It's very complicated. It doesn't help who you think it helps. And this was part of them trying to kind of go through and talk about why affirmative action being upheld by the Supreme Court was not necessarily beneficial for everybody. And especially wasn't really specifically beneficial for groups of Black people. Okay, one more screenshot. This is again from the article. And it says, in essence, questions for future tests were deemed good questions if they replicated the outcomes of previous exams. Specifically, tests where Black and Latinx students scored lower than their white peers. Test makers might argue that race was not explicitly used to determine which questions would be included, but the method used was inherently racist and biased towards knowledge held by white students. Beyond the issue of affirming whiteness as a marker of neutrality, as questions are deemed to be good when white students do well on them, the SAT is marred in a long history of racism, classism, and nativism. We'll talk about the classism as well in a little bit more. So now we have to kind of jump backwards and talk about eugenics. Talking about eugenics is really important because the creator of the SAT and of a couple of the other standardized tests were eugenicists. Eugenics is highly debated sometimes, and when you say the word eugenics, people will tell you that's not what you think it is. It doesn't follow how you think it does. It's not this, it's that. But the problem is eugenics at the end of the day in an American context, and even in a UK context, are based highly in racism. Eugenics before the 1920s did deal a lot, debatably, a lot more with trying to, come up with the best solution for essentially the strongest people to get ahead. So if you've done some research and know anything about Charles Darwin, we know that a large part of, Darwinism is supposed to be the strongest survive, the strongest will, push ahead, the world, people, that type of thing. Eugenics plays a large role in with that. And eugenicists believe that if you can improve the human species by selectively mating people with specific desirable hereditary traits. It aims to reduce human suffering by breeding out disease, disabilities, and undesirable characteristics from the human population. Now, what we consider undesirable, again, the word undesirable has a large effect on this because you're calling something undesirable. Undesirability should really not be a gauging factor because undesirability is extremely and entirely based on individual preferences. Individual preferences, as we know from the last presentation, can be interplayed with race and racism, as well as systematic racism and institutional racism more specifically. And so this idea is very dangerous. This also is really important to point out because criminal tendencies were thought to be able to be bred out of the gene pool. It was also thought that you could breed out mental illness and other conditions similar like disability. So in this time period of the early 1900s, eugenicists thought if somebody has schizophrenia, just don't allow them to reproduce, and then you won't have any more schizophrenic people. Really problematic, very problematic. But again, this is the part of the history. So historically, eugenics encouraged healthy people who were typically thought to be rich and white people to reproduce and discourage the reproduction of the mentally challenged or anyone who fell outside of social norms. It was very popular in America during the first half of the 20th century, and it became more negatively associated after the 1920s and 30s because it was very heavily associated with Hitler, and is the reason Hitler decided to try and take over all of Europe. It's also his justification for killing Jewish people. So again, eugenics has a very deep, dark root. It's important to understand these roots because again, people will say that's not what it's about, but eugenics as of 1920s and onwards is extremely rooted in racism and classism and so on and so forth. Now, the American eugenics movement, like I said before, was in the 20s and 30s. It was one of the biggest, most long-standing, impactful movements I think we've seen in the last few hundred years of American history, a couple hundred years of American history. The American eugenics movement created sterilization laws, and they resulted in the forced sterilization of over 64,000 people. So I want you to understand, 64,000 people were forced to be sterilized so that they would not reproduce in order to prevent the so-called, dirtying of the genetic pool of America. So when I say that eugenics is only rooted in classism and racism, it can only be rooted in classism and racism in this context. And furthermore, Charles Davenport, who we'll talk about in a little bit, was a prominent biologist, and they founded the Eugenics Record Office, and this was allegedly to improve the natural, physical, mental, and temperamental qualities of the human family. They worked to collect data, and they were particularly interested in moving out undesirable traits, which they considered pauperism, which is again associated with poor communities, mental disability, dwarfism, promiscuity, and criminal traits. Eugenics became a large part of academics, and it became highly popular in social movements during the American Eugenics Society founding, which kind of fired up this already growing movement in a worse way. Members of the American Eugenics Society would compete in Fitter Family and Better Baby competitions. They would make movies about and encourage people to kill their children if the children came out with diseases that were considered to be undesirable by the group. And they began to enact sterilization laws. The first state that enacted a sterilization law was Indiana. This was in 1907. It happened very quickly in 28 other states by 1931. So by 1931, 29 states had sterilization laws. The laws resulted in, like I said, the forced sterilization of over 64,000 people in the United States. At first, they were focused more heavily on disabled populations, but as the American eugenics movement grew, they became to support people who were criminals, who did things that were considered criminal, and typically it was associated with people in poverty. The sterilization programs they were found legal support in the 1920s as well, and were reinforced by the Supreme Court case Buck versus Bell. So again, lots of problems with eugenics, heavy problems. Now, with that being said, the creator of the SAT was Carl Brigham. So the SAT, like I said before, was created in 1926, and it kind of sparked this large revolution of standardized testing across the country. So before this, we didn't really have standardized tests, especially for education, that were like this, and we didn't have such a wide reliance on these tests in order to gauge people. The SAT being created and being seen to be implemented more and more then led to all these other tests popping up. So I'll show you the dates again so that you can keep in mind the fact this is one of the first tests, and this was to gauge people in that level. Now, Carl Brigham was a eugenicist. He was part of the racial purity movement of the American eugenics movement. again, the movement that led to the sterilization of thousands of people in the United States. And Brigham wrote that the test, whenever he founded it, was, oops, there's a typo. He wrote that the test would help prove the superiority of the white race and prevent the infiltration of white blood into the Negro. These are his words, word for word. And this information, again, if you're curious, was by the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review. They went and did like an entire expose on all of this to kind of go through everything, you know, and kind of separate this out and talk about it, since it was getting very muddled. Because people have tried to, you know, reunite the eugenics movement as a very positive thing, and it is definitely not. So, with that being said, oh, someone's talking about this. Yeah, it's directly linked with the eugenics movement. So every time you see the SAT now, I want you to remember, this is directly, no question, directly linked with the eugenics movement. Now, the European national groups, because eugenics grew heavily in the UK first before kind of hopping over and becoming a part of the American system. So we see it heavily there. I'm not going to talk about the UK's roots with the eugenics as much, because I think that itself might need to be a different presentation. But just a reminder that this became a large part of all levels of education. So in addition to movies, there were books that were coming out, you know, stories, things that were heavily popularized by popular culture and the educational system that reinforced these ideas. It was also used to basically allow for Jim Crow and other things. And this is all happening around the same time. So if you think about it, at the same time, you have, you know, World War II kind of, you know, going on, you've got all this happening. And then you have the eugenics movement growing, and you have this sharp increase in systematic racism in the United States, and a high level of lynchings at this time. So this is all going on around the same time together. Now, I'm going to show a quick little video that talks about Francis Galton and a little bit of James Davenport and eugenics, just to kind of add on to anything. I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's really long, but Crash Course, I tend to like most of their stuff. I do think sometimes that there is kind of an over caution with Crash Course in trying not to dirty certain things like eugenics, you know, trying to say like, oh, well, before, you know, 1920 it was great. But I want you to be wary of that. So I'll play this and turn around the camera for my Instagram folks.
A very influential zoologist, founded the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in 1910. He collected data to help people check whether a potential marriage was suitable, and maybe unsurprisingly, Davenport was a fan of the Nazis, but probably the eugenicist most well known to us today was the nurse who coined the term birth control and opened the first U.S. birth control clinic in 1916, Margaret Sanger. Sanger founded the American Birth Control League to educate people about safe abortion procedures and contraceptives. She gave lectures on birth control to many groups, including the KKK in 1926. In the 1920s and 30s, Sanger thought that eugenics would give her movement legitimacy. By the late 1920s, eugenics had been recognized as bad science by most practicing biologists, but as a source of policy for many lawmakers in the United States, Germany, and elsewhere, eugenics was still very much alive. In the 1800s, science had become much more important for states. They wanted to understand their populations and now shape them. Compulsory sterilization was challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1927 in the famous Buck v. Bell case. But the decision, written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., sided with the eugenicists and has never technically been overturned. In fact, forced sterilization was still happening in California prisons until it was banned in 2014. Did Galton think that studying human difference would lead to bad science and even worse laws? Not necessarily. But in some ways, his legacy, a legacy of comparing humans quantitatively, is still with us. Next time, we'll see what's going on in a less creepy area of the life sciences. It's time for Pasteur, Koch, and the birth of microbiology. Crash Course History of Science is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all these nice people.
Okay.
And if you'd like to keep Crash...
So again, just kind of a little touching on some of those people that we talked about. And the origin of the eugenics movement. I'm also going to play you all another video that talks about the sterilization and a little bit more about the history of that and how that played into the education system.
Nita, you say that this is not new, that the concern about the potential harm that can come from tinkering with the genetic code is really not new. And you say that people are sort of predispositioned to have a negative view of it because of our history in this country. Take us through that and tell us why this is either the same or different.
So I'll start by saying I think the techniques of today are very different than what I'm about to talk about. But if we go back in history to the late 1800s and the early 1900s, we have something called the American eugenics movement. And the American eugenics movement started with some scientists who were not terribly unlike our prominent scientists who are here with us today, who are incredibly well-intentioned, but who at the time really misunderstood the science, starting with some really basic concepts of genetics, which some of you may have learned early in genetics classes, like Mendelian genetics. So the idea that traits are simply, that there's two characteristics of a trait or two alleles for a trait, and you inherit them just that simply, and every trait from eye color to everything else just has two little alleles, except traits are incredibly complex. And they thought, if this is true, if we have this kind of concept of heredity, then we should be able to breed much better populations. And we can do so through selective breeding by trying to encourage people who have what we think of as preferential traits to have children together. And we can, by doing so, get rid of some really undesirable traits, such as, and the ones they were really focused on were things like criminality, as if that's just one trait, or epilepsy, or imbecility. That was a really popular one, which is we just had to get rid of these imbeciles. And you can see this kind of, progression here, which is different characterizations of imbecility that we just have to get rid of. And you might think this sounds crazy, and it does to us today, which is one of the safeguards we have against the kind of eugenic policies that we might go down. But as you'll see in some of the slides that now follow this one, there's a lot of things that were incorporated into this. So what happened is a lot of states started having better baby competitions where people would actually then have photographs of the multiple generations, which they measured by things like height or color of skin or color of hair. And it was used and incorporated to try to combat things like immigration policies, because people believe that immigrant populations were bringing bad traits into the population, or to try to increase the amount of sort of intelligence that they thought we might have in the population, and to decrease some of the more problematic traits. But at the same time, we had a lot of mental institutions. And mental institutions across the country were used for every different kind of person. So things like criminals to things like feeble-minded people to people who we thought were insane. I mean, this was the solution to a lot of different problems in society, was just institutionalize people. Over time in the early 1900s, some of the states started having problems where it started to become a little bit unfavorable to do this. So Virginia had a good idea. Virginia thought, we're going to pass one of these statutes, and the first person that we are going to ultimately sterilize is going to be a person who comes from a family of feeble-minded individuals. And in the case of Buck v. Bell, what happened was Carrie Buck's mother was already institutionalized and had been deemed an imbecile. Now, mind you, they didn't query what kind of education she'd received. This must have had a hereditary component. This is Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck was her 18-year-old daughter, 17 here in the picture, who was also deemed to be an imbecile because she could only read at an 8th grade level when she was 17 years old. And she had a daughter, Vivian, out of wedlock, and this was before she was institutionalized. The assessment to Vivian was she must be an imbecile as well. So Carrie was going to be the first person that Virginia was going to sterilize. And it turned out that Carrie was represented by an attorney who tried to actually prevent her from being sterilized and argued that she wasn't such an imbecile after all, and that she had rights under the US Constitution, in particular that it was cruel and unusual punishment to sterilize her and that it would violate her due process of law. And the United States Supreme Court receives this case, looks at all of the evidence before them, that is that Carrie Buck's mother is an imbecile, that Carrie is an imbecile, that Vivian is apparently an imbecile because she doesn't look quite right. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's one of our most famous jurists, who has penned some of the most famous opinions that stand to this day, wrote in a very important opinion that it was okay to go ahead and sterilize Carrie Buck. And the reason it was okay was because 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Right around this time, early 1900s, getting closer to World War II, Germany had also started adopting these broad eugenic policies. Mein Kampf, written by Hitler, adopts a lot of the language of the American eugenics movement, and there was a lot of cross-dialogue between American eugenicists and Germans. As we see what the progression of that policy was in Nazi Germany, the eugenicists in this country, that word eugenics was not a terrible word as it is now. It was actually a mainstream and good word. It simply meant better babies and better health. As that became incorporated into Nazi Germany and people saw the horrors to which that could be taken, they distanced themselves from the policies of eugenics. And we now have this horrible specter of eugenics that colors the entire field. So it's impossible to have this conversation without people immediately going there and assuming what's going to happen if we do something like mitochondrial transfer is the next step is massive sterilization of everyone or massive eugenic policies of just trying to have blonde hair and blue-eyed kids.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop that there. I want to also note how she very quickly passed on saying that there was a problem with the origin of eugenics. As you heard, there clearly was always a problem, but there is kind of like this large-scale push to minimize that history and to say, you know, it's not bad, and you know, the concept of trying to create a better race is great, or a better group of people is great. It's not. Very, very touchy, and I want to emphasize that it should not be taken lightly as she's taking it. Now, I did show you this because I wanted to show you that, as well as show how great of a summary I think that she did and talking about this issue. So it's important to kind of note all that history. I know that's a lot of time spent talking about eugenics, but eugenics is really important because it framed a lot of our educational standards. And when something has such a large hand in framing the basic way that we function, you can't surpass it. It has to be addressed. So now we're going to go back again, take another step back, and talk about systematic racism again. So if you watched the presentation from last week, this definition is not new to you. If you did not watch it, then this will be new for you to learn. So systematic racism is again, from my definition and other definitions that I use and kind of tweaked, systems and structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage and or disenfranchise oppressed groups of people. It includes the policies and practices entrenched in established institutions which result in the exclusion or promotion of certain groups of people. So remember, we talked about exclusion versus promotion. It can be either and or both. And with that being said, if you think about the fact that the framework for the SAT was very literally to uplift white people and to disadvantage Black groups, which the SAT doesn't just disadvantage Black people. The SAT and other tests disadvantage a lot of different groups. Literally everybody and anybody essentially that is considered brown or Black or indigenous. And so this has to be talked about because this is very literally systematic racism, right? Systematic racism is this idea of excluding and promoting certain groups concurrently or separately, while institutional racism is and are the policies that kind of keep this going. So as you heard, even within the American eugenics movement and the sterilization of people, that movement was pushed so heavily to try and just really minimize folks and really get rid of them. And that's, again, really not good. So I want to show you this graph one more time, also from last presentation. And what it is overt racism versus covert racism. We talked about that briefly. Overt racism is essentially racism that happens. It's easier to point out. It's more seeable. It's more obvious. Covert racism is less obvious. It's kind of harder to pinpoint and it's harder to remove. Overt racism is relatively easy for most people to understand, whereas covert racism tends to be very complicated to a lot of people. And so in these examples, the overt racism is, very clearly part of this eugenics and that type of thing. But the covert racism are things like the SAT and the barrier that the SAT and these other tests provide to certain groups, as you all saw from the questions, there are certain things that people wouldn't know how to do based off of their class and or race possibly. It's also important to note that during this time period, we still had a heavy amount of segregation. And so Black people were literally not allowed to do certain things, right? So you hear kind of this joke about, oh, Black people can't swim, Black people can't swim, or, you know, this group can't do this or that and that, so on and so forth. And that's because they would literally not allow Black people to go into pools. So if you have been restricted from doing a certain activity and then a test asks you a question on how that activity works or what it's compared to, you might not know the answer because you've very literally been systematically and institutionally pushed away from doing that activity. You've been disallowed to do that. The activity could endanger your life. And so you might not understand the comparison. And if that is then put on a test and then intentionally ignored when the results show that it doesn't work, it's very literally systematic and institutional racism at work. So general barriers to education are obviously systematic institutional racism, like I just talked about. They affect a lot of different groups in different ways. If you want to know more about that, you can watch the presentation from last week. Also, classism. Oops. Hold on one second. Okay, so also classism. Classism plays a really large role in education. Classism can, you know, really affect everything from the amount of cost to pay for tests to the actual accessing of the information that's on the test and the way that these things affect different people. And classism has to be discussed when you're talking about barriers to education, because if, you know, for example, yachting is a very expensive, you know, thing to do, right? Most people don't have yachts. Most people don't go on yachts. And there was a question, which I'm going to try and find the link to this, but there was a really big controversy at one point because there was a question on a test about yachting, and it was about like the structures of yachting. And if you've never been yachting before, you wouldn't know the answer to that. I've never been yachting before, and I'm sure a lot of you probably have not. And so that's direct classism at work. Poverty, which kind of works with classism and racism, but is a separate issue to acknowledge, also is a barrier to education. And then last but not least, disability. As we heard, the eugenics movement wasn't just about race, it was about class, and it was about ability and disability. It was a very ableist movement. And disability is thought to be addressed in educational barriers, but it really is not as much as it should be. As a student who has gone through some of these procedures myself, disability processes on campuses have gotten better, right? But it also varies depending on what your disability is. So there's a high level of disparity based on what kind of disability you have to deal with. And so when things aren't, again, equally and in an equitable way being dealt with, you're still gonna end up with really bad disparities. Now, I'm not gonna show this whole video, but it's a TED Talk kind of talking about how we have to change the way we think about access to higher education. Like I said before, a lot of what we're gonna talk about today was and is directly dealing with more of like the undergrad and graduate levels, but it's important to talk about all levels of education, kind of the access that is limited. I'm just gonna show a minute or two.
I'd like you all to close your eyes, please. This is the sound that ended my father's education, and I would like to tell you why, and why it is still of relevance today. Now, if you haven't done so, please open your eyes again. Let me take you back to Kabul, Afghanistan, 1971. Back then, it was in no way comparable to the Kabul that you would think of today, plagued by terrorism, corruption, and overpopulation. The Kabul that I am referring to back then in 1971 was a small, peaceful city of roughly 300,000 people under the reign of King Zahir Shah. In that Kabul, I would like to introduce you to Muhammad Yahya a 16-year-old high school student who had a strong passion for literature and was literally craving for knowledge. One day, Muhammad Yahya, or to me, simply Baba, which means an Afghan dad, had fallen ill and was suffering from fever. Despite his illness, my Baba made it to class, which sounds like any other regular school day. But this was certainly not the case that day. His teacher falsely accused him of disturbing class. My Baba, knowing that this was not the truth, confidently stood up for himself and denied his teacher's accusation. In his traditional attempt to discipline my father, the teacher got up to slap him. But my Baba did something extraordinary. He did not let the teacher slap him and even stopped him, which resulted in this exact same sound that you just heard at the beginning. As a result, my Baba was kicked out of school, which also meant ultimately the end of his education. And that's exactly when he decided to go beyond borders. Refusing to believe that his opportunities in life and his educational pathway had come to an end, my Baba made it to Hamburg, Germany in 1971. Nowadays, you would call such a person an economic migrant, which is, according to the Oxford Dictionary, a person that travels from one country to another in order to improve their standard of living. Wow, what a broad term, standard of living, isn't it? It's quite abstract, but at the same time, so real. So how do you try to improve your standard of living? Education seems to be the key, allowing us to cross from one social layer to the other, essentially enabling us to live a self-determined life. But let me take you back again to Hamburg, Germany, 1971. So there is my Baba, a young Afghan man, 17 years old, with no high school diploma, not speaking a single word of German, but with big dreams and the ambition to make it in the new society. Not only refusing to believe that his education may have come to an end, my Baba was also actually quite confident that he could succeed in higher education. But without a high school diploma, there was a 0% chance to get into university.
Okay, I'm going to stop that there. This whole TED Talk is really fascinating, but because it's 10 minutes long, I recommend people go watch it themselves. But just kind of considering even then how such a small incident can really change someone's education. This is not a foreign concept. I also showed this because, and I meant to mention it earlier, but the large part of the American eugenics movement that these founders were a part of also was anti-immigrant, heavily anti-immigrant. They did not believe in other people coming from other countries into America. And so this idea of this man going up and moving countries would have been absolutely angering to the group, because they thought of other countries and immigrants as being unintelligent and as sustaining this idea of white purity. Something else to consider. But this idea of an incident removing somebody from education is not singular. We've seen this happen so many times in modern systems of American education systems, where a student will have something happen and that's the end of their education. I've even, in certain circumstances, been accused of cheating in classes that I very clearly was not cheating in, and the teachers got offended at me defending myself. And so it's really, again, a problem that we have these ideas of what education should be like, and the idea that somebody having, even if it is an incident that did happen, removing them entirely from being able to complete that education. And that education is very literally the key to improving yourself. More often than not, education has everything to do with access to better healthcare, access to better wages, better standards of living, and so on and so forth. I do recommend you watch the whole video though, which again, I'll link at the end. And I have one more little video. A lot of you that are on Facebook especially have probably seen this clip. It's a very, very, very famous video that went viral a few years ago by this man who does different raps and things talking about different issues. But I'm only going to play like 10 seconds.
Your Honor, but if a doctor prescribed the exact same medicine to all of his patients, the results will be tragic. So many people would get sick, yet when it comes to school, this is exactly what happens. This educational malpractice where one teacher stands in front of 20 kids, each one having different strengths, different needs, different gifts, different dreams, and you teach the same thing the same way? That's horrific. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant should not be acquitted. This may be one of the worst criminal offenses ever.
Okay, so again, short clip of that video. I think that video is also 10 minutes, right? But it's a crazy concept that we are essentially trying to standardize everything about education, whenever education really should be and best thrives when it's more specific. And I mean, I think that analogy is a very good analogy in kind of discussing, it would be crazy for a doctor to prescribe the exact same thing to everybody at the same dosage amount. You would never do that in medicine, ever. That would never be a good thing unless all your patients were exactly alike with the exact same symptoms and the exact same diseases. And then that might happen, but even then it still might not, because there's different progression levels of diseases. Some people need higher dosage, lower dosage, and so on and so forth. And so the idea that we treat our education system in that way of prescribing the exact same style of teaching and the exact same information that's given to everybody doesn't make sense. And so at the very root of this barrier to education is this idea that everybody learns the same way. And when you think this way, you essentially erase the fact that there is classism that exists, there's, ableism that exists, there's, poverty barriers, and that there's systematic institutional racism that exists. You essentially pretend that nothing changes and you move forward with an idea. And this idea has been linked also back to the eugenics movement. So this idea that if you just kind of filter things out, you will get rid of the people that don't fit this standard. So it's a very intentional thing. It's not an accident, but this falls back into that covert racism idea. And so trying to directly link it is, often not seen. Most people don't talk about this being directly linked to eugenics because they think that's a crazy jump. But as you've seen, it's really not a big jump. And they're all interplaying at the same time. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about money, again, and kind of talk about these different testing formats, because each test, right, like I said before, the SAT kind of gave way for all these other tests to happen. So the SAT was 1926, the PSAT was 1971, ACT 1959, GRE 1949, GMAT 1954. And these tests all came after the SAT. Another thing to think about is that these tests are extremely expensive. Like, these tests, in order to do well, can cost so much money, and the amount that it costs depends on the type of test. So, as you'll see, I found a little graph that I thought was really helpful. And this was just online, for trying to help high school students figure out how much money they're going to have to spend to do well on their SAT. So, self-guided study guides for the SAT can be anywhere from $0 to $50 per book. And if you want to do 40 hours of prep, you most likely need multiple books. You could spend anywhere from $0 to $200. That's, not a crazy amount of money, but it's been proven that people that do these other forms of courses do a lot better on these tests than people who do the study guides. Study guides can work for certain types of learners. They can sometimes help a lot, but it's entirely you figuring out yourself. So there's really nobody to refer back to. And it's a very offhand teaching style. And, as we know, in schools, we don't kind of have teachers give us books and then just send us off with no help. Interacting is a really large part of teaching. And whenever teaching styles are more interactive, students overall tend to do well. So these online programs can be anywhere from $100 to $1,400 per course. And if you get multiple courses, it can be anywhere from $100 to $2,800 in order to do this. That's a really wide scale. And $100, again, may sound great, but some of these online courses are not as well created to equip students as some of the more expensive courses. Moving on, you can read the in-person courses that vary from $800 to $1,800 per course. And the one-on-one tutoring can vary from $40 to $200 per hour, which can end up costing $1,600 to $8,000 to prepare for a single test. This is just the SAT we're talking about, not even any of the other test formats. And something else to consider is the PSAT and the SAT from College Board and other testing groups sell their testing answers that are more current to different groups. So places like Kaplan and types of prep universities or prep academies, whatever you want to call them, buy these tests that are more current from people in order to be able to give their students the most up-to-date information. And so if you can't afford the better testing companies that have more current information, you can get older tests, but older tests are not going to have the more current styles as the newer tests. And so if you're buying a $100 course, it may give you tests from 1995 or from 2010, but the SATs have changed multiple times since then. And the test that would probably more help you was a 2015 test, but that 2015 test is not going to be necessarily available. I can't remember the exact year gap, but it's not going to be as available to you from a cheaper course because those courses have to pay more money and those academies to get those tests. So again, large gap in inequality. And if this is the test you have to do well on to get to college, and you can't spend as much money as some other people, then you really might not do as well unless you're just smarter. And this is kind of sometimes why we're considered to be smarter, mind you, not literally smarter, because we're not using this as a system to actually and actively determine level of intelligence, but it currently is used that way. And that's why some students, as I talked about in the flyer, people always wonder, well, why does that 22% of Black people answer that question correctly? It really varies. It could be because they're wealthier. It could be because they, have different sets of learning skills. It could be because the offhand style works perfectly for them, so they can spend $200 on, 5 books and do really well. It really just depends. And that's the problem with this, is it's supposed to be an accurate system to actively and correctly determine who should go to, to what school and to where. But instead, it just ends up being full of variables that we cannot control, or that we are intentionally controlling in a very negative way. So, whoops. One second. It does not want to turn the page for some reason. Okay, there we go. So, other types of standardized testing. We can talk about the LSAT and MCAT briefly, but I know I've got some medical people on the call, so some of you all are absolutely aware of how expensive this can get. It can really be such a really negative part, and such an expensive way of people trying to learn, and it doesn't work for everybody. Now, quick pause for my Facebook people. My Instagram live is about to end. I've got a minute left. So let me just briefly say, for the Instagram folks, I will post all the information for the next call in the comment section of this video, and be sure to go on my website, viabiola.com, to learn more about this. For the Facebook and folks on Zoom, we have a little bit more time, but Instagram has a time limit on how long you can go. So to the Instagram folks, adios. Now, to our other folks, we are going to continue chatting. So LSAT can very easily cost anywhere from this $20 to $120 for a review. Online course can be $160 to $2,000, or you can end up paying anywhere from $500 to $2,000 for tutoring. This is still on the lower end. Typically an LSAT course will cost you $600 to $1,500. That's about the average. And these numbers, again, were found really easily on our website, just talking about testing and trying to get people prepared for their LSAT. The similar amounts are also for the MCAT, but they tend to be a little bit higher even than that. And state standardized testing, because it varies so much, there are no exact averages, especially since most of that state standardized testing information is taught through schools. So that depends entirely on your school and the level of access your school has to doing this type of thing, and to really educating students. And so it's, again, too many variables for something that's supposed to be a sure guide of how people do, and too much of a disparity in that cost. Now I'm gonna zoom through the rest because I don't want to keep you all in here too long. More colleges are getting rid of the SAT and ACT requirements. I waived my SAT in order to go to the schools I went to because I just felt like other things were better representative of me as a person. But a lot of schools aren't doing that until now. Now more schools are starting to consider this because of coronavirus, and it's made it a lot harder for people to take these tests if they didn't take them already, since we can't gather in these large amounts. Also, having students sit in a room together for a cold room for, what is it? I think anywhere from like 6 hours, like 6 or more hours, isn't a good measure of, for safety for the coronavirus. So it's happening now more and more, and it's a good shift nonetheless, but it's still not happening at the rate that it probably should be happening. And it's really only happening because of the virus. This is not really happening because of the roots and because of the inaccuracy of this as a predictor for success. This is a snapshot from a site that I really enjoyed reading from, and it's from 1999. So this is a book that talks about standardized testing not measuring educational quality. It talks about how you're not really using the right measurements to see how people are going to do well. Because again, this is supposed to be a predictor of how students are going to do when they get somewhere. And this talks all about that and how it's not a good relatively. It also talks about, teachers and kind of their value being tied to standardized tests for K through 12. How schools are measuring how well their teachers are doing by how well the students are doing on the test, things that really shouldn't necessarily be determining one another that are. Now, I've got some book resources. There were so many books on this, so many, and you all are more than welcome to read any book. These are the 3 that came in the most highly recommended. I wish I'd gotten to spend more time with them, but I had a lot of work to do this week for my own school. But the big test is probably the first and foremost, most highly recommended on this entire issue. It was written in 1999, but it is extremely relevant and is, again, a really, really, really well-written, thorough rendition of why American testing does not function correctly and where it comes from. So it touches briefly some of the things I talked about, as well as more. And it also talks heavily on classism and how classism plays this fact into the standardized testing. It was written by Nicholas Lehman, and I recommend it to everybody. I think it's fairly cheap on Amazon, or if you know of like other sites that you can get books off of, you can find it there. But it's definitely recommended. The scandal of standardized tests came up a lot when I was doing my research, and it was written by Joseph A. Soares. It's more current. I believe it was written in 2019 or 2018, if I remember correctly. And it's talking about why, again, we should not be using the SAT and ACT as a predictor for for success for students. And then last but not least is the Black-White test score gap. This specifically talks about the disparities in Black and white students and how they score on these tests and kind of the issues that go back into that. I really, really, really heavily recommend that one as well. I believe it's cheap, I think. But it's another one of those that was written a little bit ago, but it's still really relevant. So in about the 1990s, there seemed to be a big wave of people kind of talking about, moving past the SAT and these other forms of tests, which is why a lot of information that you saw was from the 1990s. The information is still a good information to use. The data is still accurate data because it's still within a reasonable data gap, but there is more current data, like I said, in the book in the middle, called The Scandal of Standardized Tests, and there's more accurate data provided in all my other information. So here are my lovely resources, right? Again, all of this and the slides will be posted on my website probably tomorrow from today, so you can click on these yourself and go through them. These do not include the books because the books are previously, so you saw those already that I also took resources from. And as always, you can look these up and kind of send me your thoughts and everything else on them. Now, before I answer questions, I want to remind folks that all of these presentations are being uploaded to YouTube every time after I do them. So I try and always put the full presentation on YouTube. You can go rewatch them and kind of engage with everything that's happening on here and, learn from it, as well as ask questions in the comments, send me anything that you might have on these topics. Now, last but not least, I was, again, asked to do this, so I'm trying to keep these up. For people who want to donate to the work I do, you can donate at the options here. You want one of the one-time payment options, just send me a message and I'll send you the information. And Patreon as well is very easy to use. It's basically where you can go on and pay $5 a month to get all these different free, cool things that I do, like my newsletter. You can get private consulting, that type of thing. Now, I am going to take any questions that the audience has. If you want to ask them now, you can while I'm on here, but I will also be taking them later and going through comments and helping people as needed, as I said before. So I'll be on here for another 5 minutes or so to answer some questions. And if you all have anything else that you want me to address regarding literally any topic, now's the time to do that. Okay. But I will also be taking. Oops. Okay, so I'm seeing now on here. Oh, Nettie had a bunch of great stuff to say. Oh, and Kevin Thornton. Yeah, Teen Vogue is doing really great on the information. I'm really honestly proud of them. And as Nettie pointed out, the American eugenics movement had a tremendous impact on Nazi thinking. It's important to note in 1928, Hitler remarked approvingly that white settlers in America had gunned down millions of Redskins to a few 100,000 when he spoke of Lebensraum, the German drive for living space in Eastern Europe, and he often had America in mind. Really important point. Thank you, Nettie. Literally, Nettie is great, guys. The eugenics movement was so heavily linked with the Nazi movement. And a lot of things you'll see people say, well, it was a good movement before, like it became associated with Nazis. It didn't become associated with Nazis. It was fueled heavily by Nazi propaganda. And a lot of Americans that were involved in the eugenics movement in that time period were also Nazis. So they work together. It's not something that's, lightly associated. They're definitely part of one and the other. So thank you for pointing that out, Nettie. And also, as she points out, oh wow, California's sterilization program directly inspired the Nazi sterilization law of 1934. Great information. And there are also sinister or mostly coincidental similarities between American and German technologies of death. Yes, execution by gas chambers took place in Nevada, as she points out. The history of the American gas chamber states that the fumigating agent Zyklon B was licensed to American cyanamide by the German company IG Farben, which is considered to be as a lethal agent, but found to be impractical. It was used as disinfectant to disinfect immigrants as they crossed the border at El Paso. Very important. That's why I said the eugenics movement and anti-immigrant propaganda heavily involved. That's why it's very scary, some of the things we're seeing today, especially with Donald Trump in office, and some of these, different theories that are very dangerous. And she also talks about gas chambers being outfitted with a chute to drop down poison pellets. Yes. Pouring acid. Oh, here's a quote from Earl Liston, inventor of the device. Pulling a lever to kill a man is hard work. Pouring acid down a tube is easier on the nerves, more like watering flowers. Much of the same methods introduced at Auschwitz. Eee. Yeah, that's very, very disgusting. And again, I have to emphasize, that's why people lightly comparing these and saying like, well, they're associated. It's very dangerous because it's not that they're just lightly associated. They are one and, and one and together interacting. So it's very dangerous. And then she includes an article, which I will also include on the end. It's very dangerous. And I really hope that people will start to recognize when things in history are repeating themselves, That's why I think it's very dangerous whenever people always want to say, like, don't compare what's going on now to, what happened in the 1920s. But what's going on now is similar to what's happening in the 1920s in a lot of ways. And there are concentration camps, even in China right now, they're holding Chinese Muslim folks in these camps and killing them, So it happens and it's very dangerous. And then also, we have a question about the Trump commentary. So Donald Trump was, I think, recorded, they said, saying that he knew the virus was dangerous on February 7th of this year. This is not shocking to me. It's not surprising in any way, shape, or form. And again, it has to deal with a lot with media and the propaganda that goes into media. So the media, even now trying to refute this, trying to play it off. Certain media sites that related to, like Breitbart, saying that, it's false information. Next talk, actually, which I forgot to post a flyer for in here, is going to be in 2 weeks, again on Thursday. And we're going to talk about media bias and how the media literally directly plays in systematic racism. I don't even know if I'll be able to do that talk in an hour. I'm going to try and keep it down to an hour because that's what I try and do it close to. But media working with this systematic racism that happens is so influential. and really dangerous. When I tell you guys that the media very literally has created some of the institutional racism that we've seen, by the over broadcasting of, you know, Black faces intentionally when a crime is committed by Black people, you know, the refusal to show certain stories, just all sorts of things that kind of play heavily into this. So very dangerous. And I don't think I see any other questions. Well, we've been going a long time today. So I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Remember, you can always comment more questions. If you're on YouTube, you can comment questions and I'll go back and watch and respond to them later. And I want to double check on Zoom and make sure we don't have any questions ourselves from folks. Whoops. So we're going to go in here and make sure we don't have any other people. Oh, we do have it. Okay. So can we discuss the current institutionalized education racism with the state of e-learning? Yes. So institutional racism has been reinforced in e-learning because it's put people at home in places that may not necessarily be safe for them. There are really a lot of aspects that are dangerous about, not dangerous, right? Because people have to stay home partially, or else the virus will continue to spread. But it's reinforced certain things that were already unhealthy. Even access to food for certain students, people have talked about. So certain students have had to figure out ways to eat at home, you know, not ideal. Certain students are in homes where they can't study, things that we would normally think about, but that can really affect a child's education and even an adult's education. You know, for people that may be moms that are at home with 4 kids trying to learn, trying to attend online classes, none of it's easy. And if you have certain things like the ability to hire an in-house tutor, which can be extremely expensive, you don't deal with these same factors. So classism is heavily playing a role in how we're currently seeing and viewing education in an institutional format. And it's, you know, really negatively impacted a lot of people's ability to learn. So it's, it has really reinforced it. Also, just in general, some schools, if you have a poorer school district, they don't have the ability to properly do the online learning systems. Students may not have access to the internet, and if they do, you know, the teachers aren't being paid for the extra work it takes to do online classes. I'm at Boston University, and I have a job here where I work and help teachers that have a hard time, or teachers in general, not even they're having a hard time specifically, try and make sure that the online students get the same attention and access as the in-person students, and that the teacher can easily go between the two. And we're being paid to do that, but a lot of schools aren't doing that. So these teachers are having to spend hours trying to relearn how to teach, and having to learn how to do things on Zoom like we're doing now, having to kind of do something that they weren't taught to do. And it just, again, it's all about access, ability, and so it's made a lot of these institutional systems a lot worse. So it's a big problem, it's definitely a big problem. Any other questions before I close out? I think I got them all, but I want to be sure. Okay, I'm not seeing any more. So I'm gonna go ahead and close out. I wanna thank you all for staying on. I know this was a lot longer than some of the other ones. Like I say, try and keep it under an hour, but I don't wanna leave you guys without the proper information to at least understand the basics of this. You can learn more at all the links I've put, and if you have questions, you can look at that at theaviola.com, and I will include all the resources. So thank you all for joining me, and I will see you in 2 weeks for Media Bias. Bye. Oops.